I'm Anne Lounsbury. I'm professor of Russian literature here in the Department of Russian Slavic Studies and a member of the Jordan Center Faculty Advisory Board. I'm extremely pleased to be able to welcome Professor Wang, who's an associate professor of Chinese literature and culture at Brandeis University. And Professor Wang and I met when we happened to be seated next to each other at brunch at Brandeis, and I quickly learned how interesting his work was and became very interested. So we're thrilled that he's able to come speak to us. Professor Wang received his BA and MA from Peking University and his PhD from NYU's own comparative literature department. His interests center on modern Chinese literature and culture in comparative context. His first book was published in 2018 by the Harvard University Asia Center. It's called The Translatability of Revolution, Wu Moro and the 20th-century Chinese Culture. This was the first English language comprehensive study of the towering and highly controversial figure of Chinese revolutionary century. In 2019, Professor Wang co-edited a special issue of the journal Frontiers of Literary Studies in China, which was titled Old Stories, New Mediations, Transmedial Representations of the Past in 20th Century China. And currently he's working on 3 different scholarly projects. There's a book on modern Chinese travel literature, a volume of poetic criticism in Chinese, and a series of essays, also in Chinese, about the controversies surrounding the global 60s and its legacies. He also has translated a critical biography called Benjamin, which is forthcoming. So thank you very much, and please join me in welcoming Professor Wang.
And good afternoon, everyone. It's my honor to share my work with you here. Let me first express my gratitude to Professor Anne Lounsbury, who encouraged me to take on this topic and invited me to speak of the Russian soul and the Soviet human in Chinese culture. And I thank the Jordan Center, especially Sasha, for hosting me and organizing this event. Thank you for having me, and thank you for being here either in person or online. Hardly can I describe how delightful I am to be back at NYU, to be back in the same building. You know, I was a graduate student of comparative literature upstairs from 2006 to 2012. The first course I took here was a pro-seminar in comparative literature taught that year by Professor Ian Posky. And he asked every student to present on any short text of your own choice. And the text I chose was Anton Chekhov's short story, The Student. But in general, I was trained as a scholar of Chinese literature, critical theory, and translation studies. So how could I be possibly qualified to speak among the best Russianists and Slavic scholars? As I mentioned to Anne during our conversation at Brandeis, my current project is about the 20th century Chinese travel writing, in which Chinese writers' travelogues about the USSR figure prominently. While working through these textual encounters with the Russian Soviet people, I found my way back into a literary space that is very intimate to my own formation as someone growing up on the mainland China. And that literary space is the world of Russian literature in Chinese translation. I have no Russian, and I have never ever tried to learn that language except on Duolingo. But I can remember vividly the afternoons I spent reading Mikhail Lermontov's Hero of Our Times. As riveted and confused as a middle schooler could be. Then when I spent my high school summer break in a provincial small town, I found a copy of Gogol's Dead Souls at my uncle's apartment. I laughed through the whole chapters of book 1 until the very end. But that ending gave me a feeling that was as vast as the Eurasian continent. I'll never forget the midnight when I rushed to the last page of Crime and Punishment. Yes, it's always a midnight when you finish a Dostoevsky novel, and a Turgenev novella belongs to the evening. My indulgence in Russian literature concluded in college at the very beginning of this century, I was a Chinese major at Peking University, but for that major, the only required course of a single foreign national language was Russian literature. And it remains the case for most Chinese departments in mainland China even today. So you may feel that I'm just sentimental about my own kind of formation, about growing up reading Russian literature in mainland China, but it's a tiny testimony to how crucial and central Russian literature has been to many generations of mainland Chinese. My personal formation is an objective consequence of a larger collective historical formation of Chinese modernity characterized by Russian Soviet influences. But I've also come to realize the peculiar status about our knowledge of our knowledge about such influences. These influences have been so pervasive that they are taken for granted for those who are well-versed in modern Chinese literature. In my field, that is modern China studies, the presence or the omnipresence of Russian influence is common knowledge, sometimes too conventional to be even mentioned. But it is not necessarily something familiar to outsiders and to Russianists. That's partly why I think I may be able to contribute humbly a Chinese perspective to the conversation at the Jordan Center. So I will divide today's talk into two parts. The first, longer part, will be my take on the role Russian Soviet literature played in China's cultural, intellectual, and spiritual transformation throughout the revolutionary century and the following post-socialist period. I must warn you that the general picture I'm going to draw is quite incomplete. My review of recent scholarship is insufficient, to say the least, nor will it be a carefully arranged chronological narrative. Rather, I will try to provide a montage of cultural memory that moves freely between three periods and brings them together into a story about the continuity and change of China's irresistible love for Russian literature and culture. The three periods are the periods of new culture from the late 19-teens to 1949. The second, the socialist and Maoist periods, so the 50s, 60s, and 70s. The third, the post-Maoist age of the economic boom and the global rise of China. That is a period that Professor Xu Dongzhang characterizes as China's post-socialism. Then the second, shorter part of today's talk will take a reverse direction, focusing on not Russian literature going to China, but Chinese literati traveling to the Soviet Union. I will provide a case study of 4 Chinese revolutionary intellectuals' travelogues about the Soviet Union, chosen from the 1930s to the early 1950s. I will explore the Chinese authors' encounters with the Soviet human, Homo Sovieticus or Sulian, and interrogate the utopian possibility of travel and solidarity in the 20th century, a century that was a Soviet century as well as China's revolutionary century. Okay, let's begin. So my review of the importance of Russian Soviet literature in modern China starts with a recent publication. 2 months ago, Hong Zicheng, a retired professor of Peking University, published a new book titled World Literature in Contemporary Chinese Literature. By contemporary literature, Hong means Chinese literature of the People's Republic, so basically post-1949 literature. In chapter 1, Hong draws our attention to a 1954 document. This document is titled A Recommended Reading List of Political Theory and Classical Literature for Literary and Artistic Categories, passed by the Presidium of Writers Association of New China. the section on literature is divided into three parts: China, Russia and the Soviet Union, and the rest. The reading list for Chinese literature has 35 titles. For Russian literature, there are 25 titles of the great tradition of the 19th century, from Pushkin to Tolstoy. And for Soviet literature, nine titles, including works by Gorky and Mayakovsky. So the total count of the Russian Soviet list is 34, only one short of the Chinese own national literature. Other foreign traditions are lumped together in the last list, the rest, where you will find the usual suspects, Homer and Shakespeare, and so on. Revisiting this reading list designed for the cultural cadres, writers and critics, and party workers, Hong demonstrates that in socialist China's vision of the world literature, quote, the world is divided into two, Russian Soviet literature and the rest, end quote. Another point we can tease out from this book is clearly this. Just as socialist Chinese culture imagined itself as part of world literature, so Russian Soviet literature eventually became a domestic part of Chinese consciousness and Chinese literacy. It is part of Chinese new cultural literacy. Similarly, Nikolai Wallen's book, Socialist Cosmopolitanism, aims to, quote, read Chinese socialist literature as world literature and tries to draw the contour of a literary universe, the literary universe that we know as socialist world literature. Quote, the socialist world permeated Chinese culture throughout the 1950s, end quote. That was the honeymoon period of China's deep alliance with the Soviet Union and the East Bloc. Socialist world literature means texts in motion through collective and party state agencies. Wallen's book includes fascinating accounts about the Chinese popularization of Soviet novels, Soviet science fiction, and Soviet children's books. And by the way, even how the steel was tempered by Nikolai Ostrovsky with 900,000 prints in the first 5 years of the People's Republic was not even the top one best-selling Russian work in the 1950s China. But the Chinese engagement within Russian literature predated this socialist cosmopolitan literature, predated this socialist literary universe, and even predated the founding of the Soviet Union. Then where should we trace the history of this initial affinity that in fact preconditioned China's final entry into this socialist commonwealth of world literature? We further flashback and turn to Lu Xun, a founding figure of Chinese new culture and new literature. In his final years, he worked as a spiritual leader of Chinese leftist culture. In 1932, Lu Xun wrote an essay titled Ties Between Chinese and Russian Letters. He argued that the true Chinese-Russian ties had little to do with whether there were mutual formal diplomatic recognitions between the government of the Soviet Union and the anti-communist government of the Republic of China. Rather, these ties were to be found in a literary affinity based on struggle for social change. When the Chinese youth, quote, wanted to struggle, they discovered Russian literature and learned that Russian literature was our guide and friend. Lu Xun continued, from Russian literature, we can see the kindly soul of the oppressed, their sufferings and struggles. Of course, this is very important. We knew that Tsarist Russia was invading China. But the literature taught us the important lesson that there are two sorts of men in the world, the oppressors and the oppressed, end quote. Lu Xun's words bears remote resemblance to Nikolai Berdyev's comment. The quote, "The great Russian writers of the 19th century created not from the joy of creative abundance, but from a thirst for salvation of the people, from unhappiness and suffering, from the injustice and slavery of man," end quote. But for Lu Xun, the Russian soul was nothing religious, was nothing close to what Berdyaev sees as the explicit or implicit Russian Christianity. Rather, it was the historical experience of the social suffering and struggle with which the Chinese could easily identify. Lu Xun further saw a continuity between this Russian literature and new Soviet literature. Quote, "We have seen for ourselves endurance, groans, struggles, revolt, fighting, changes, fighting, construction, fighting, success," end quote. This is where Lu Xun came closest to a synthesis of the oppressed soul and the Soviet humanity. From there, the shaping power of Russian literature emerged in China. Lu Xun himself had been a translator of Russian literature by German and Japanese sources very early on. In 1909, when he was a student in Japan, he translated short stories of Andreev. In the 1920s, he translated Asbashev, then Erashenko, then Plekhanov and Lunacharsky. In 1931, he translated Fadyev's Route, and it was met with great success. He spent his final days translating Dead Souls. That translation was left unfinished on his deathbed. Immediately after his death, he was compared to Gorky and idolized as China's Gorky. The recent decades has seen a surge of scholarly interest in the transmission, translation, and interpretation of Russian literature in China. What Lu Xun characterized as the ties of two literatures can also be interpreted in Katerina Clark's frame of Eurasia as a leftist cultural commons. From this common fight for a just society, socialist China then developed a new literary love for the role model of the Soviet man. Mark Gansab generalized the function of Russian Soviet literature in the People's Republic as, quote unquote, a moral manual for practice. But this view seems to me to be rigid, underestimating the range of and multivalence of Chinese interpretations of Russian Soviet literature under Maoism. For example, Professor Hong is not the only one who remembers the reading of Anton Chekhov complete stories as an escape from the prolonged cultural revolution and its Maoist politics. Mu Dan, one of the greatest Chinese modernist poets who received his MA from University of Chicago, was denounced as a counter-revolutionary under the Maoist rule. And yet he spent his darkest days on a verse translation of Pushkin's Onegin. In neither case did the Russian classics function as textbooks for the socialist practice. This leads me to my next point. As we've seen, the Chinese passion for Russian literature didn't start as late as the Soviet-Sino alliance, nor did it come to an end in the ages of Sino-Soviet split, the Cultural Revolution, the US-China rapprochement, and finally China's market-oriented reforms. In fact, this literary engagement continued strongly into the era of marketization and the new century of China's global rise, but with a shift of focus, a change of perspective, and a quite different ideological emphasis. A shocking evidence of the changing face of Russian literature can be found as early as the early 1970s on the underground poetic scene. In the second half of the Cultural Revolution, a rusticated Beijing student, while being sent down to the countryside, wrote a poem dedicated to Marina Tsvetaeva. This young poet later took a pen name, Duoduo. For Duoduo, the name of Tsvetaeva symbolizes the art of a free poetic language and its ecstasy. This poem, dated 1973, is usually celebrated as an origin of the second wave of Chinese modernism. And we can also see this poem, for me at least, as a foreboding of many changes to come in the Chinese interpretation of Russian modernity. In fact, a number of Russian-related texts can serve as the signs of the continuity and discontinuity between China's own two ages. A bridge from China's socialism to Chinese postmodernism was actually Ilya Ehrenberg's memoir, People, Years, Life. This book was translated in the 1960s as a negative example of Soviet revisionism. But during the Cultural Revolution, a young generation, including the poet Duoduo, devoured this text eagerly. And through it, they discovered the Silver Age modernism, the repressed literary voices in the USSR. The second example was again Chekhov's short stories. In 1979, 3 years after Mao's death, as the country showed a clear tendency of going beyond Maoism, Zhang Jie, a woman writer, published her debut story, Love Must Not Be Forgotten. In this story, a married male party cadre and a divorced female intellectual fall into love. The most erotic thing in their unfulfilled love affair is that the party cadre gives a whole book set of Chekhov's stories as a comradely present to the female. Chekhov is then a love letter, a token of love, a symbol of the private interiority that has been reduced to the minimum by the Maoist Cultural Revolution. So translations of emigre Russian writers mushroomed in the 1980s as well. As Jing Yichu indicates, by the mid-1980s, the Chinese scholarly community had already started to embrace the non-revolutionary narrative of Russian literature, promoted by the emigre groups and the Western academia, in parallel to the traditional narrative of a democratic revolutionary Soviet lineage. Then the Chinese poetry of the 1990s opened with an invocation of Pasternak. In a post-Tiananmen context, it seems that the return to normal life requires a spiritual endurance. Tsvetaeva and Akhmatova has continued to haunt the Chinese poetic imagination, merging into a wide-ranging translation and promotion of the Silver Age Russian modernism towards the 21st century. We can also see how, since then, Chekhov's plays have been celebrated in China as modernist texts suitable for the avant-garde mise-en-scène. Even the socialist realist novel, How the Steel Was Tempered, was adopted by the Chinese experimental theater. At the center stage was no longer a Bolshevik hero, but an existentialist individuality. More suggestive is perhaps the case of Liu Xiaofeng, a leading cultural figure in post-socialist China. A philosopher trained in both China and Switzerland, Liu once reinterpreted the female character Tonia, the first love of the protagonist Pavel Kochagin of How the Steel Was Tempered, as the true trope of a generational collective memory in China. That was Liu Xiaofeng's own generation. That was Xi Jinping's generation. A religious philosopher, Liu was then among the first to introduce the works of Lev Shestov and Berdiaev. He also edited a book series in Russian philosophy of the Silver Age. In particular, Berdiaev's Discourse of the Russian Soul was then widely translated and accepted in China. You can see those book covers of different translations of Berdiaev. And finally, at the beginning of this century, Liu Xiaofeng finished his own book titled A Narrative of the Descent of the Holy Spirit. In this book, he combines theology with literary criticism. His interpretation of religious experience is largely based on a reading of Dostoevsky and Dmitry Merezhkovsky. And he decisively links the Russian Christianity to his critique of the spiritual vacuum in contemporary China. If Lu Xun's reading of Russia is a narrative of social suffering and the struggle of the oppressed people, then Liu Xiaofeng's reading is a narrative of the spiritual suffering and the coming of the Holy Spirit. Both universalized a Russian spirit and a Russian experience, but no contrast could be sharper. While the so-called democratic, progressive, and revolutionary narrative faded away, what remained was the Russian soul, an image that was constantly aestheticized and mystified in China's post-socialist understanding of the world. So I dare to summarize the transition of the Chinese interpretation as follows. From the social struggle to the spiritual struggle, from the golden age to the silver age, from realism to mysticism, from Mayakovsky to Mandelstam, from Belinsky to Berdiaev, from Lenin's Tolstoy to a theological Dostoevsky. I must confess that I, for one, was deeply moved by Dostoevsky's Pushkin speech when I was in college. But in the age of Putin's war in Ukraine, how are we going to read the Pushkin speech in China? What are we going to do with this mystified Russian soul as a universal soul in today's China? After the outbreak of the war, a Chinese online platform interviewed a number of Chinese literati, asking them what Russian Ukrainian literary texts they have been reading in response to the war. It's a peculiar question because you cannot ask other kind of questions. You can only ask what kind of Russian texts are you reading these days. One writer said she turned to Isaac Babel. Another mentioned Life and Fate. And the war also overlaps with the Chinese publication of Frank's epic biography of Dostoevsky. And I picked up again Chekhov's short stories. Reading Russia became one of the ways in which China understood its own modernity and remains an important perspective from which China to engage itself in a changing world. So it is high time now to interrogate this history of encounter and interpretation from a shared desire for social change to the Soviet role model, and finally to the Russian soul mystified as a spiritual supplement. So hence, I think we can wrap up our first part of today's talk, and we shall switch the gear. We've focused on the texts in motion, traveling from Russia to China. And to end today's talk, we're going to look at the writers in motion, traveling from China to Soviet Union. And we will see how, this kind of reverse direction, it's a kind of reverse movement of our first part's discussion. will become another site for this new interrogation of Russian-China's ties in this changing cultural, political, ideological landscape of the 20th century. But making this move, I want to use a quote from a famous travelogue, The Return from USSR by French writer André Gide. This passage proves to be a turning point in modern travel writing. Travel is no longer about the naturalist tourist encounters with the landscapes. Ce qui m'importe, c'est l'homme, les hommes. I'm sorry, I didn't provide the English translation. I did my preliminary research for this project while I was in France. It concerns the encounter with the human, the Soviet humans. So human first as singular, then as plural. It is about what we can do with the Soviet humans. As we have seen, what underlay the texts traveling from Soviet Russia to China was a profound interest in the transformation of the Russian soul into the new Soviet human. Today, I will explore such real encounters with the Soviet humans in a series of travel writings by revolutionary Chinese literati, including Hu Yuzhi, Guo Moruo, Mao Zedong, and Ding Ling. This new kind of Chinese travel writing was part and parcel of the emergence of Soviet travelogues as a new genre in world literature and international cultural politics in the first half of the 20th century. Roman Roland was with Gorky and Stalin, and Tagore was in Russia, and then Walter Benjamin had a posthumously published Moscow Diary. And these are just some famous examples. There are more and more and more. Travel means a movement between the familiar and the unknown, a human condition of mobility and a social spatial experience of otherness. Travel writing has been indispensable to literary modernity. My study seeks to demonstrate another possibility of spatial political mobility in the non-West context, the possibility of self-liberation, of embracing otherness, of searching for the utopian, of developing solidarity with the new communities defined not by the empire or capital. Travel writing of Chinese revolutionary intellectuals to the USSR are an intrinsic component of what Lu Xun summarized as looking for a different kind of people. Through travel and travel writing, the Chinese Revolution was connected with, in a concrete and mobile way, with the quote-unquote infinite land of the far away and the innumerable people of the far away. All these leftist Chinese literati on the road were keenly aware of the difficulty that beset the USSR and the limitation in certain aspects of the Soviet life. But their focus was on the heroic effort of the Soviet people to overcome the challenges. Hu Yuzhi's impressions of Moscow turns to ordinary Soviet people and their struggles during Stalin's first 5-year plan. A leftist representative of the Esperanto movement in China's new culture, Hu Yuzhi went into exile due to the right-wing nationalist campaign against the leftists in 1927. On his way back home in 1931, Hu made strenuous efforts to stop over in Moscow so that he could meet the Soviet Esperanto activists. And he states at the outset of the travelogue that the greatest reward of this short trip was the discovery of humanity, even though his short stay in Moscow was not necessarily a pleasant one. Whose travel writing offers a detailed record of his first and perhaps the worst day in Moscow. He is trapped in Soviet bureaucracy. he finds Moscow's public transportation crowded and dysfunctional. He also writes about his first lunch at a workers' dining hall. The cuisine is totally bad. But what immediately comes to his mind is a comparison with, quote unquote, overproduction of food in the West and the shocking waste of the bourgeois restaurant industry in European countries. He thus expresses his preference for the collective way of food preparation and consumption. By the end of the day, he has firsthand knowledge of the low living standards of the Soviet Union and the daily difficulties facing the city dwellers. At last, Hu settles down in a student's hostel. There, an encounter with Soviet young people leads to the first climax of his travelogue. The living condition is not of high quality, but a group of high school girls from Crimea are also checked in at the same hostel, and they throw a welcome party for Hu Yuzhi. From the girls and their leaders and their teachers, he receives warm greetings, not only in Russian, but also in the Tatar and Yiddish tongues, in whose eyes they are truly international Soviet youth because they are not, quote unquote, Russian, but consider themselves as members of the Oriental or Asian nationalities, quote unquote, formerly oppressed by the Russian Empire and now freed by the Soviet Revolution. As a result, the Crimean girls have profound sympathies for the Chinese nation that is now struggling for liberation. It is with such real encounters, despite language barriers, that Hu eventually identified the young Soviet Union as a true human world. Some believe that Soviet life is anti-human. What I saw was the contrary. Let's go back to the whole list of our travelers. Hu just visited Soviet Union when Stalinism was still in the making. And he noted the debates between Stalin and Trotsky on the national question. But more than a decade later, on the eve of Japan's final surrender to the Allies, Guo was keen to report in his travel diary that Comrade Stalin was in great health. In 1945, Guo had no reservation in asserting that, quote, the ancient imagination of the utopia is reality in the Soviet Union, end quote. What did Guo find most utopian in Stalin's Soviet Union? While Hu Yuzhi may count as an uninvited visitor to Moscow, Guo, Mao Dun, and Ding Ling were all honored guests of high profile when they toured the Soviet Union. Guo was invited by the Soviet Academy of Science. Mao Dun's whole trip was arranged by VOKS, and Ding Ling was traveling initially as a member of Chinese women's delegation. One may suspect that with their travel so officially prepared, Guo, Mao Dun, and Ding Ling would have less opportunity to make spontaneous encounter with ordinary Soviet people than Hu did. Here we come to Guo's case. It's very interesting that when Guo had this unconditional celebration of the realization of the utopian in Soviet reality, that moment actually comes with an observation of Soviet nightlife. Guo notes that the Soviet workers are great theater lovers. Even though there are so many superb theaters, all the tickets are soon sold out. This is utopia in reality because the Soviet human is not only industrious builders, but also enjoys high culture. Because the Soviet human embodies the combination of labor and leisure, political economy, and aesthetics. I truly admire such citizens, quote. their well-deserved reward is surely the pursuit of a just enjoyment of life, unquote. His perspective shows an ideal of a full, holistic, well-rounded development of the human that is going to resonate and reappear in many other Chinese depictions of Soviet life. In contrast, Mao Zedong was by consensus a novelist of realism, studying his subject matter like a social scientist. Unlike Mao Zedong's travelogue pays particular attention to the social structure, institutional development, policies, and organizations. The Soviet humanity is a social being that must be understood within concrete organizational terms. But so far, all these travelogues we have been reading are by male writers. This seems to confirm a pattern in traditional travel writing as a male-centered genre. The traveling writer tends to be a privileged male, and they meet up with other privileged males. Did the revolutionary dynamic of the 20th century bring a change to this pattern? Was the Soviet human also a female identity? To end my case study, let us turn to the last case, a Chinese woman writer traveling to the Soviet Union. Ding Ling, usually considered as China's greatest feminist communist writer, traveled to Europe and Soviet Union in 1949 and 1950. She collected all her travel essays in Notes on My Trip to Europe. What distinguishes this book from the previous travelogues is that one of the essays is titled 3 Soviet Female Heroes. This essay records Ding Ling's encounter with 3 women workers introduced by a female veteran party member. All of them believe that the Soviet worker should be the master of machines and technology, and all of them practice self-learning. Ding Ling sees this group as exemplary of women's liberation. Quote, the Soviet women are never separate from production and work, and yet in the meantime, they expand their social contexts and visions, thereby elevating their passion for work and their understanding of the world. It is then Ding Ling, the Chinese revolutionary woman traveler writer, that offered a summary of what are the characteristics of Soviet human, Sulian Ren, this time in the gender-neutral Chinese expression. One last essay she wrote about her 3 trips to the USSR is entitled Sulian Ren, the Soviet human. With this note, we can conclude. I don't want to romanticize or idealize the mobile search for an utopian alternative to the human society. In fact, the Soviet model not only inspired, but also limited the Chinese imagination of socialism, to say the least. But I will argue that a fundamental desire of the 20th century as a leftist century was the search for the faraway people as the real people, and the formation of transnational solidarity through concrete mobility. The affinity with the new possibility of social change, the eagerness and readiness to learn from otherness, seems to be missing in the highly spiritualized interpretation of Russianness in post-socialist China on the one hand, and in today's geopolitical imagination of a globe in crisis on the other. We're living in an age of globalization and deglobalization, in an age of connectivity and decoupling, in an age of US-China new Cold War and the real war in Ukraine. Our contemporary travel in both pre and post-pandemic forms presumes the foreign, the far away, the other, as a pure object of consumeristic desire framed in a capitalist world system, confronting the 20th century that is China's revolutionary century, as well as a Soviet century, confronting this solidarity based either on literature emotion or leftist human contexts, I'm made to ponder, can we still use this revolutionary legacy of the engagement in Russian Soviet modernity to critique today's given structures of the state, geopolitical calculation, commercial tourism, and cultural fetishism? Is it possible to seek new forms of solidarity and mobility? These are the questions with which I'd like to end today's talk. Thank you very much. Sure.
Thank you very much, Professor Wang. That was fascinating. Tatiana Lukoyeva.
Hi, I'm Tatiana Lukoyeva, assistant professor of Japanese history here. So I'm interested in the earlier period, and because I studied a bit of the reception of Russian literature in Japan, in North Japan, and you mentioned that the first translation, Chinese translations, were done from the Japanese language. So my question is, do you think the perspective, the way the Japanese read and translated Russian literature, did that way influence the Chinese reading of the Russian literature?
A lot. That influence is a lot and decisive. Yeah.
Because the way what the Japanese picked, right? What kind of text they picked in the Russian literature, and the way they put emphasis and the way they did translations, right? I'm sure that it was some, the way that through the Japanese perspectives they are looking at Russia.
Yes, and actually that kind of mediating role is comprehensive. It goes beyond Japanese translation and interpretation. For example, the major source of German books for Chinese intellectual and intelligentsia was the Japanese book industry. So the Lucian got those texts either in Japanese or in German through Japanese venues. So that's number one. So it's a very, very comprehensive influence. Of course, with more and more specialized Chinese translators rising in the 1940s, and especially rising after the founding of the socialist republic, the role of Japan as a mediator declined. But at the very beginning, it was extremely crucial. So I will give you more examples. So there were at least two major influences. One was China's initial encounter with truly contemporary Russian literature. As you can see, what Lucian translated at first was already Silver Age modernism rather than the classics. Of course, they learned of Pushkin, Tolstoy from the textbooks, but when they started to translate, there was no generational gap. They were translating Andreev and other Silver Age modernism stuff. So Japan really played a synchronizing function there as well. And Aryushenko had a really extended stay in China, but Aryushenko first traveled to Japan. So due to kind of his legal status threatened by Japan's alliance with the British government, that was the first war kind of stuff, the British-Japanese alliance. He had to find new destinations, and then he chose Beijing. So because of Japan, and largely with Japan as a transit place, there was this kind of truly synchronized literary possibility over there. And then in the 1920s and 30s, when Lucian and the whole Chinese intelligentsia turning to leftism, the theoretical orientation was provided by Japanese introduction of Russian Soviet stuff. So Lucian picked up Plekhanov and Lunacharsky from Japanese sources. But Lu Xun was not the only one. Lu Xun's critics and opponents picked up Lukács and other sources through Japanese translation of German and Russian theories. And unfortunately, all these came to a sudden pause because of the Second Sino-Japanese War, the war of resistance against Japanese aggression. So that eventually the Japanese leftist community also declined. Yeah.
I have actually another question. Sorry, yeah. This is a bit a tricky question. So in the sources that you showed us, the primary sources, so China is described by the Chinese writers as oppressed and colonized.
Yes.
And my question is, by whom is it oppressed? By whom is it colonized?
So this goes back to a kind of number of questions about the status of China as semi-colonial nation state. So China was a little bit different from other Asian African countries, for example, like India or continental African countries. It seems that there was a sovereign government in China. So sometimes it's hard to explain why the Chinese people had this very basic fundamental national feeling of being oppressed and colonized in a legal sovereign government, under legal sovereign governments internationally recognized. So for Lu Xun's generation, the main territorial invaders were Russia and Japan. But that feeling of oppression came from the quote unquote semi-colonial status. That is, China's economic rights were largely in the hands of the US, primarily in the British, and then secondarily in the US and French powers. So China's, eventually the leftists saw China as a target of imperialist competition. So it doesn't matter whether you have a sovereign government. So that's why the nationalist government of the Republic of China was always belittled by Chinese patriots as a bankruptcy, because the true power are in the hands of British financial sector and the US aid and other powers. But going back to Lu Xun's quote, you can see in terms of territorial integrity, what comes immediately to Chinese mind is Russia and Japan.
Thank you very much.
Mhm.
Brandon Schechter.
Thank you very much. Brandon Schechter, visiting scholar at the Jordan Center. I'm curious that in your story, the Sino-Soviet split seems to play no role.
Mm-hmm.
And I could see how that would be the case, but I'm wondering if you can talk about if there are shifts in terms of what is read or just not reading Russian stuff in the immediate aftermath of the.
Sure. Yeah, I think the Soviet Sino-Soviet split needs to be further emphasized and studied in the field of China studies and in the field of international and global studies, especially in Cold War studies. From a domestic Chinese perspective, the change to the perception of the Soviet Union was fundamental. But at the same time, when it comes to literary reading, the classics of the Russian Soviet tradition were continue to enjoy a really privileged status in the Chinese consciousness and continue to enjoy an official endorsement. However, there was a new kind of edge of Marxist criticism, turning more and more into a discourse of Maoism. That is, more and more Soviet works would be translated but labeled as an example of revisionism. So, and more works that came out of post-Stalinist period will be labeled as, will be categorized as for the reading of cadres only. So they were not for, they were for the purpose of critique. So this is the same when it comes to other forms of cultural exchange. So actually, the Soviet New Wave cinema was also introduced in China, but primarily for the critique of the professionals, the Maoist professionals of art cinema. And yet, I think any underestimation of Russian influence in the anti-revisionist Maoist period would be problematic. For example, the Maoist model plays, including the revolutionary ballet. When it comes to revolutionary ballet, the red detachments of women soldiers, everyone can hear from the music the resonance of Tchaikovsky, but it's definitely not Shostakovich. But if you turn to other Chinese films, you can definitely see a very clear kind of influence of the Soviet cinema industry. So that's the basic frame of reference. So even if they want to go beyond Shostakovich in terms of cinema music, they have no place to turn.
Thank you. Our graduate student, Nate, the teacher.
Hi, so I had a question because you mentioned I study primarily theater, and you mentioned the Soviet influence on the Chinese stage. But when you go back to the Russian theater modernists, they
Sure.
were all highly influenced by the Chinese stage.
Exactly,
when
yes.
They were conceiving of the new Soviet man like Meyerhold
Right.
and Tretyakov, and you mentioned the
Exactly.
Internationalist Aesthetics book. All kind of thought, they all saw Beijing opera and were like,
Yes.
thought that was like the peak of acting, and they really tried to sculpt their training programs around that and their actor pedagogy. So do you think, in a way, Chinese culture had a hand in building the Soviet man that later made its way into China?
I think that's the one of the themes of internationalist aesthetics, China and early Soviet culture. That book tells the story from the other side. That is how the Soviet Union, especially its early, more kind of experimental avant-garde culture, imagined China as a focal point of internationalism. And I think there is a kind of change of frame, because sometimes our first response to Mei Lanfang's trip is always the encounter between Mei Lanfang's Beijing opera style and Brecht's, that is Marxist modernism. But what is missing is the Soviet link. And more and more kind of archives are now available also from the side of Beijing to see how that kind of cultural exchange was played out in a highly intensive way, at least in the 1950s. People try to focus on the 1950s also because that's the period where both Chinese authorities and the Soviet authorities preserved tons of materials. It's easy to leaf them through, but I think it's not limited to the 1950s. However, the murky period is the Maoist period. So we do see the conversation, the cultural kind of similarity and conversation was still there. But that kind of, all the channels of actual people-to-people context and cultural exchange was totally gone. It's always interesting for me to see, sometimes people are more interested in the Western imagination of what Maoist China was. There was also Soviet imagination. When you turn to Tarkovsky, you will see Mao's image, and you will see the border conflict. But of course, Tarkovsky belongs to that generation, the post-Stalin generation, who would have never had the opportunity to be invited to China, but for the earlier generation, for the Moss film and all, there was kind of really intensive kind of exchanges and programs of cultural exchange. And in that regard, I think a lot of influences are very hard to be tracked down simply by kind of documents. But if you see the performances and texts, that mutual kind of conversation is always there.
Thank you very much. We have one question from the chat, and then I'll go to Meng-Kian. The question from the chat is from June I, and it says, "Thank you for this wonderful talk, Professor Wang. I'm interested in the case study part. You mentioned how Chinese writers traveled to the USSR and the ways in which they imagined the Soviet human in their travelogues. My question is how these Chinese writers discovered the Soviet human and produced the knowledge of the humane, mundane aspects of Soviet life."
That's a very good question. So that goes into the real logistic details. First of all, so for the early travelers among Chinese revolutionary literates, they did not necessarily have a concept of the Soviet human. So the new man as a concept was eventually invented and enshrined in the People's Republic. But they definitely had their own ideological packaging over there. So in my case study, I was primarily focused on revolutionary travelers. There were other travelers, non-partisan travelers or anti-revolutionary travelers, or similar cases to the French case of André Gide, having a high hope and promise when going to USSR and coming back disillusioned. All these kind of cases. But for those revolutionary travelers, sometimes there is a kind of difficulty, and this comes up whenever I present this kind of work, as whether their encounter with the Soviet humanity was already in their partisan presumption of the Soviet life. So for example, I had to go a little bit faster. So the way, all of them attribute the Soviet hardships to the heroic transition towards socialist, everything could be explained away by the difficult transition to socialism. And they will always focus on the more positive aspects. But my work is, as a literary scholar, I really want to work between the lines. And then there you will find the interesting aspects of how they have a true encounter, but this encounter is partly of their partisan ideological orientation, but partly is really a kind of part of the mobilization and mobility of people on the road. That's why I think travel literature is fascinating. It's not ideological justification or apology. Even the most officially prepared and well choreographed trips are human trips. We're on the road. So they are delayed in the airport for overnight. They all have first-hand experience of Soviet bureaucracy and how big this country is, how many languages they speak, and how difficult it to go through all these barriers. So I want to see how their trips are arranged, and from that logistic aspects, the most interesting thing is that their most exciting moment in their travel writing is usually not what the Soviet hosts would like to see. So that's where I think that is most interesting. For example, I mentioned Mao Zedong as a social scientist on the way, and the first question he has when he's on the boat from Shanghai to Vladivostok is to ask the salary of the sailor, and then the next question: do you have the access to the club? And these are questions, you know, where you see kind of more spontaneous aspects. And these are the questions that will give us really interesting textual traces of the travel as a kind of human mobility. And I do feel there is a clear tendency of less and less kind of spontaneous activity throughout this historical period, because there was also the parallel story was the establishment of cultural diplomacy in the USSR. And especially the turning point from the Chinese perspective is the victorious status of Stalin's Soviet Union in 1945. So everything was now channeled into a highly pre-planned kind of cultural exchange with so many agreements previously signed as government to government, agency to agency documents. And then when you sign those, you have this guest and so on and so forth. But that's also why I chose all the four cases from the pre-1949 periods, and with the exception of Dingling, but Dingling's travel took place on the eve of China's communist triumph. And for me, Dingling's value is that it's really important to see another agency. This agency is the women's dedication to the USSR, and you had the peace movement sponsored by the Moscow government, and you have another one that is the International Democratic Women's Confederation, sponsored by the Moscow. And I try to see this diversity, but definitely you will have more and more agency to agency activity rather than the people to people activity.
Thank you very much. I think those of us who remember traveling in the Soviet Union, remember, you know, you'd be taken to the Statue of Lenin and you would be told how many meters tall it is, but you were waiting for precisely these kind of serendipitous encounters that you hoped were about to come, or you got to ask somebody how much money you made driving a cab or something like that.
Yeah.
So thank you very much. We have a question, I think, from Maggie on, who's our Jordan Center research fellow.
Thank you so much, Professor Wang, for this really wonderful and inspiring talk. So my question is about the when you describe how this China's reception of Russian literature went through kind of a transition from the realm of political and social struggles to the realm of aesthetics and mysticism. Because that transition kind of parallels the Russian literary history's transition from critical realism to Silver Age modernism. So what do you think might be like the conditions or the causes of that transition? Like, is it a contingent one, or there's some necessity, like a universal paradigm behind that?
Right. I can, you know, that's why, you know, at the very beginning, I tried to warn everyone of the kind of sometimes biased kind of picture I gave you about this whole story. But I wanted to be like that because I really wanted to bring my own personal and contemporary perspective to it. I was the generation that experienced this high wave of translation and introduction of Silver Age modernism into China. It took place at the turn of the 20th century and the 21st century. And we were the reader, we were really avid reader of this transition. But that transition, of course, had a best-selling point over there. That is, previously we only knew realism. We only knew the great tradition from Pushkin to Tolstoy. But actually, we missed a lot. We missed Tsvetayeva and so on and so forth. But you see, there was always a kind of generational gap, because actually the previous generation already knew Tsvetayeva, but Tsvetayeva was labeled as some especially Akhmatova. Akhmatova is someone, a noble lady, but who is also a kind of bitch, and so on and so forth. That kind of a Zhdanov period, they had all this knowledge, but they had a different take on this. But later on, at the century when I was growing up in China, all of a sudden we had a kind of re-encounter with Russian Silver Age, and that really fit into China's depoliticization. But from a literary perspective, it doesn't mean that here we need to bring the nuance. It doesn't mean that people stopped reading Tolstoy, but I do feel like my generation, we read Tolstoy in a different light. So definitely not from the Leninist perspective that Tolstoy is the mirror of social reality of Russian history. No, we started to see Tolstoy also as a religious philosopher and so on and so forth. That kind of perspective was brought back because for Lu Xun, of course, Tolstoy was a religious philosopher because Tolstoy was a major kind of voice against the Russian-Japanese war, and that was the war, you know, for Lu Xun's generation. So you see, there were a lot of time lags, and there were a lot of times when we believed that we rediscovered something, but it was always already there. But all of a sudden, in a depoliticized China, was this new wave of modernism, both domestic and international kind of engagement. Translators and intellectuals started to say, hey, actually, we missed out Russian modernism. And finally, there was actually always insight and blindness. Then the blindness is to the early Soviet avant-garde. So no one would remember early Soviet avant-garde until recently. So there was always this kind of uneven development. But for my generation, yes, we loved Silver Age modernism, and we eagerly waited for new translations of Tsvetaeva. And every time people would promise, this time it's more faithful translation. This, you know, it's similar to Northern Edition or Random House and so on and so forth. But actually, it's always translated. It's just like every generation will have a new Tolstoy. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I don't see any other hands right now, but I actually have a question.
Sure.
And it's a small linguistic question about the vocabulary that Chinese uses to convey the Russian word soul, dusha, which, you know, is traditionally translated as soul into English, but has these nuances that are somewhat different in Russian. And I'm just wondering how it works in Chinese, how adequate you feel the words are that are used and consistent.
Yeah, I think this is a kind of continuation of our conversation at Brenda's. That in Chinese, soul is translated as 灵魂, and I think it's closer to the English German tradition. It's Seele and soul, and it's different from spirit. It's different from heart. It's different from mind. It's different from idea. So spirit is another key word that China's modernity incorporated from the German tradition of idealism, but in which the Russian influence was also there. But in the Chinese case, soul and spirit are very different words. But if you want to, if we want to go into kind of a figurative nuances, I think 灵魂 soul in Chinese can be more individualized, can be more bodily, whereas other concepts very important in modern Chinese critical language, spirit, 精神, or idea, 理念, they are more abstract, more totalizing and universal. Yeah. And so what do you think about the German word? So do you think it's a...
Well, I think German
The Russian words and its relationship to other
I
European.
think that in Russian, the soul versus spirit distinction is made pretty adequately with duša versus duch. And I think that it's reproduced pretty consistently in translations, as far as I understand it. I think when you start saying soul in English, I don't know, my sense is that it means toward the religious.
Yes.
Perhaps in a way that it doesn't as much in other contexts.
And I think in modern Chinese, yes, it brings the religious.
We have another question from the talk, from the chat. The first one is from Evan Alterman, and he writes, "Thank you so much for your presentation. Earlier you mentioned a certain gendered component of the travelogues, privileged male authorship, privileged male authors, privileged male interlocutors. I'm wondering if you have any ideas as to why the travelogue in general is often a result of such gendered production. Regarding your specific case studies, were there barriers that largely impeded women from being preeminent, visible, welcomed revolutionaries?"
I can answer this question from two perspectives. One is more in line with the feminist criticism in travel studies and travel writing studies. Actual feminist critique of traditional travel literature is very powerful in this regard. If we read the whole history of travel writing, because that's actually a very rich tradition and in particularly important to literary modernity, we are left with the impression that males are movers and females are moved. And this is really a question about agency. So if this is a male in mobility, then it's a traveler. If this is a female in mobility, it's a migrant. And this is the first level. And then when it comes to writing, that is even if they are, both genders are traveling, the male will write. The female has no right to write. They has no agency of documenting and recording their experience on the road. So that's why, in recent years, feminist studies of travel writing has been a kind of central part of the paradigm shift in travel writing studies. And that's also why I think it's very important to unearth those female voices. And this, by and large, is about the presumption of the lack of agency on the female gender. But when it comes to the more concrete level of the revolutionary travelogue in the USSR, it is very problematic because the USSR and Chinese communism also promised women's liberation. So, and you can only have women's liberation through a communist revolution. So that's a great kind of merger, and that's why communism was such a powerful paradigm of 20th century feminism, and eventually it turns out to be a happy marriage, as it famously goes. However, we can find traces in those travelogues. So Hu Yuzhi was helped almost always by Soviet females. That's number one. Number two, Guo Mongrui is an honored guest to the Academy of Science. He has many good things to say about the Soviet Union. That's the utopia in reality. But he mentions in passing that there's no female members on the Politburo. He mentions this. And then Mao Zedong devotes a whole chapter to Soviet womanhood. But that chapter is entirely male-centered because his understanding of femininity is basically motherhood. So you see from their kind of perspective, they seem to know this problem, but at the same time, they do not really confront this problem. And so Guo Mongrui is the same. Guo Mongrui says, in the near future, there will be female Stalin. There will be kind of Politburo members who are also female. And the only one who really picks up this question is Dingling as a communist feminist writer. And in general, I think that's where I see an international solidarity, because her first stop was Budapest, where he wanted to really engage an international community of leftist women's liberation activists, not only the Soviet ones. However, even when she only focuses on Soviet women, her definition of womanhood is radically different from the male writers' celebration of Soviet womanhood. There's no that kind of limited framework of being a good mother and being a good worker and so on and so forth. The mother's aspect is totally gone. That's why I find Dingling's account of Soviet womanhood really thrilling and important.
We have probably time, thank you very much, for one final question, which I'll read out loud, and then I'll also invite Professor Wang to say anything else in conclusion that he wants to, because I think we're supposed to wrap up at 3:30. So the last question is from Sutong Zhao, who says, thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. I really enjoyed it. As you mentioned, how Chinese writers traveled and communicated with USSR. I wonder if there's some Chinese authors' works that are influenced by Soviet literature or thoughts.
I think this influence is, as I said, pervasive, but at the same time, there are also some really nuances involved. So, for example, Lu Xun, who never traveled to the USSR, actually was the one who had the deepest engagement with the actual texts of the Russian Soviet literature. All the four travelers had no Russian. And Hu Yuzhi, of course, as a parental activist who had a lot of Russian connections through Esperanto movements, and we know eventually Esperanto movement died out in the Soviet Union. Hu Yuzhi and Guo Ruo were both well versed in German tradition. So, and Hu Yuzhi and Guo Ruo, especially Hu Yuzhi had really extended stay in France and Germany. So that's why he was never impressed by the living standard of the USSR. And Guo Ruo spent 20 years in Japan, first 10 years as students and second 10 years as activists in political exile. So Guo Ruo was a translator of Marxist sources of dialectical materialism. So he definitely saw the Soviet Union primarily as the land of actual Marxism and communism, but not necessarily as his beloved land of Goethe and Schiller. So we see a kind of different degrees of literary influences. And Mao Zedong and Dingling both consider themselves as writers of socialist realism. However, eventually, both of them lost favor of the party. I do think it is interesting to see the most effusive words about the Soviet Union sometimes came from intellectuals and writers who did not necessarily under the direct influence of Tolstoy and Chekhov and so on and so forth. It is interesting to bring these two aspects together. But in general, their spiritual offsprings, the later generation who really grew up by reading their travelogues, started to have an understanding of what is literature, largely framed in the Russian tradition. And this was going to change only in the age of post-socialist China. So I think in general, for the later generation, the influence of Russian Soviet literature can hardly be underestimated.
Please join me in thanking Professor Wang for this really fantastic talk.